subgroups. Okay. All right. So welcome back, everyone. It's good to start the share up again. So someone suggested a topic to me the other day, and I thought it was an interesting one. Maybe we'll spend a few weeks on it, which is how exactly did it happen, and is it a positive or negative? The concept that we have Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Sephardim and Ashkenazim, even within Ashkenazim, many different subgroups, and within Sephardim, different subgroups. So there's really two facets to the question. First of all, just historically, how did that happen, and what is the difference? What are the core differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim in practical terms, as far as the differences in halacha that Sephardim follow as opposed to Ashkenazim? Where are those differences coming from? Again, historically and halachically. And the second part of that question is more on a Kabbalistic level. What is the difference between a Sephardi and Ashkenazi? And who's better, Sephardi and Ashkenazim? You know, when Mashiach comes, are we all going to be Ashkenaz? Are we all going to be Sephardim? Are we still going to remain different? So this is the topic that someone suggested they were interested in. So I thought it was an interesting thing to talk about. So we'll spend some time on it. So first of all, today at least what we'll be focusing on is just the historical background of when did this happen, how did this happen, that the Jewish people sort of were divided into these two camps. And again, like I said, even within each camp, all these subdivisions. So a little bit of a background. We know that when the Jewish people were in Eretz Yisrael, throughout, really from the time the Torah was given, till really around the second Beis HaMikdash time period, you know, obviously every single Talmid Chacham, every single Torah scholar is going to have his way of thinking, and is going to have his ideas that he would give over to his students. But ultimately, during that time period, again, from the time of the giving of the Torah throughout the second, till around the second Beis HaMikdash, at the end of the day, there was one centralized body of government in the Jewish people, and all questions at the end of the day, and all disagreements at the end of the day, could be brought and were brought to the Sanhedrin, the high court of the Jewish people that was located by the Beis HaMikdash, next door to the Beis HaMikdash, and they had the final say in halacha. So in other words, if you had, you know, a rabbi in Tiberia and a rabbi in Tzfat that disagreed with each other about a certain area of halacha, so it didn't just remain a disagreement. And wouldn't it just be that Tiberia did its thing and Tzfat did its thing and Yerushalayim did its thing? At the end of the day, there was a group of Jews, a body of a court that you were able to bring any question to them, and they would have the answer. Now, even within the Sanhedrin, obviously, it wasn't always unanimous. More often than not, it was a disagreement amongst the Sanhedrin as well. But because the Sanhedrin was an odd number of people, 70 people, so because of that, 71 people, because of that, we go based on majority, and every question that was ever posed to them, there was a finite answer. Now, once the Sanhedrin paskined something, that became the Torah, that became halacha for the entire generation, the entire Jewish people, despite the fact that you could have individual rabbis in different places in the country, different places on earth, that personally disagreed. Once the Sanhedrin paskined, that became the halacha. The source of that is actually a pasuk in Chumash. The pasuk says there's a positive of Gechol Asher Yerucha. The pasuk says specifically in Devarim that any commandment, any clarification of halacha the Sanhedrin said, there's a mitzvah to follow them. And not only is there a positive mitzvah, but there's a negative mitzvah as well of loisasu, that one is not allowed to disobey a ruling of the Sanhedrin. Now, does that mean that a ruling of the Sanhedrin cannot be overturned? No. The halacha is, the Rambam talks about this a lot, that there is a concept that a ruling of a Sanhedrin can be overruled by a later Sanhedrin. So again, if a Sanhedrin passes a certain way, a later Sanhedrin can theoretically override that. The only qualification, however, is just an interesting side point, is that the Rambam says it depends what type of question we're dealing with. If you're dealing with an issue of, let's say, interpreting a certain pasuk in a certain way, let's say you have a pasuk which is vague, and the question is how to interpret it. Do you interpret it in one way, which would lead to a certain halacha, or do you interpret it in a second way, which will lead to an alternate halacha? So such a discussion, such a concept, was something that obviously the Sanhedrin would have the final say in, but a later Sanhedrin of a later generation has the right to overturn the previous Sanhedrin's ruling. Again, an individual rabbi cannot, but as far as another Sanhedrin can overrule that. However, says the Rambam, if the Sanhedrin, let's say, makes a decree, makes a rabbinic enactment, for whatever reason they saw fit. It was necessary to make it a rabbinic enactment, not as an interpretation of a pasuk, or not as an exposition of a pasuk. They're not creating or elaborating or clarifying a biblical concept. They're creating a new halacha. The Sanhedrin gets together and they decided we're going to come up with a new holiday called Hanukkah. So then the Rambam says no other Bezdin, no other Sanhedrin even, in the later generation will be able to overturn that new enactment unless the later Sanhedrin is considered greater than the previous Sanhedrin, which was unlikely because usually generations get weaker and weaker. But again, going back to the main point, when you had individual rabbis disagree throughout the Jewish people's history, from the beginning of the Torah till the second Beis Hamikdash time period, and again, even within the second Beis Hamikdash, the final say was always the Sanhedrin, and that's why we find in Pirkei Avos, for example, that machlokas really was not found amongst the Jewish people until later on in history. The reason for that is not because people didn't argue. Of course there was argument, but at the end of the day, there was always a final say, and the final say was the Sanhedrin. Now the problem is what happened when the Sanhedrin dissolved. When the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, or even a little bit prior to the Beis Hamikdash being destroyed, the Sanhedrin was not allowed to convene. They were unable to convene. So with the lack of the Sanhedrin, now is when you started to have a little bit of an issue. When the Sanhedrin is not around to have the final say in a disagreement, so now when the rabbi of Tiberia feels one way and the rabbi of Yerushalayim feels another way, so there's no way to settle that disagreement unless they get together and they sort of convince each other, which is unlikely for that to happen. There's no one that's going to override the other opinion. So because of that, what developed in the Jewish people was from the time the Sanhedrin stopped, while we were still living in Israel, at least in one country, was that you had such a thing where different neighborhoods and different cities were led by different people. Classic example of this is that we have a machlokus in the Gemara. Just as an interesting point, we have a machlokus in the Gemara about, the halacha is that Mila, if a person has a baby and the 8th day is on Shabbos, so usually you're not allowed to do surgery on Shabbos, but the mitzvah of Mila overrides Shabbos. That's a clear halacha, that's for sure, everyone agrees upon. There is an interesting question in the Gemara, what about if, let's say, the Moel forgot his knife at home and there's no Erev in the neighborhood, is he allowed to break Shabbos in order to prepare himself to do the bris milah? In other words, is he allowed to break Shabbos and carry the knife from his house to shul? The actual circumcision itself for sure overrides Shabbos. The question is, what about machshirei milah? What about those things which are necessary steps in order to facilitate a milah? Does that override Shabbos as well? That was a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar. And the Gemara says that in the city of Rabbi Akiva, they were not allowed to break Shabbos to bring the knife from the house, carrying on Shabbos to bring the knife from the house to shul. In the city of Rabbi Elazar held that you're allowed to do that, and then in his city, that's what they used to do. So in other words, at this time when there was no Sanhedrin to have the final say in this debate, for example, then the debate remained, and each city followed its Rav. That's the way it was. Now, this concept, how each city sort of had its own Rav, was manageable. It was manageable during the time where the Jewish people were in Israel. Fine, because again, at least we're in one country, and there's some cohesiveness, there's some connection between communities, and therefore, even though there were debates, like I mentioned in this case of bris milah, there was such a debate. However, at the end of the day, they didn't become such extreme differences because, again, all the rabbis were generally coming from the same yeshivas. They were learning by the same people. So even though there were differences in halacha, but the differences were more subtle and there were more particular details, but they weren't such major issues. This system of what was taking place continued on even after the Jewish who were exiled from Israel. For a long time, the major Jewish community was in Bavel, was in Iraq. That's where Talmud Bavel, that's where the Babylonian Talmud developed, was in Bavel. Even after the Babylonian Talmud was completed, for the next few hundred years, the main body of the Jewish people were living in Bavel. Now, at this time, again, now we're talking about after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, we're talking about a few hundred years AD. Again, the Jewish people were the main body of the Jews who were in Iraq. Jews started to settle in other places. Jews started to move to Europe. Jews started to move to Spain, to North Africa, also all over the places in that part of the world. Nevertheless, despite that, since the center of the Jewish people primarily, and specifically the center of learning, was in Bavel, so whenever a question came up, let's say you had a settlement in Germany at that time. And so Germany had its rabbis, and they were somewhat learned, and they knew how to deal with the normal things that would come up in a normal Jewish community. However, when things came up that they didn't have the answers to, that they were unable to answer because they were limited in their svarm, they were limited in their knowledge, and so on, the questions would always be sent to Bavel. That's what they were always sent to Bavel. That's why the main body of works, of Torah works that we have post Talmud in Bavel were the writing, the tshuvas, were responses that we have from the Gaonim. Gaonim, these were people that were leading the Jewish community in Bavel, and their main function was to answer shilas that came to them from all parts of the world where Jewish communities lived. Because again, the center of learning was in Bavel. So within Bavel, yeah, you had different yeshivas, and some rabbis disagree with each other. But again, since it was in one community, one country, one place, so there was some cohesiveness, and the differences between one rabbi and the other rabbi within Bavel were again subtle, and they weren't major differences. And if a question came up in Europe, or a question came up in Spain or Morocco, wherever the case may be, where there were no centers of learning, and they were only dependent on what was taking place in Iraq and Bavel, so they would send their questions to Bavel, and the Rosh Hashiva in Bavel would have his answer, and everyone throughout the world would follow the same halacha, because it was all coming from one place in Bavel. What happened, around 600, a little bit more, like 800 AD, was that because of political issues and because of financial issues, the Jewish community in Bavel in Iraq began to deteriorate. And no longer was Bavel considered the place, the hub, the center of Jewish life. The center of Jewish life was beginning to really break apart, and other communities started to sort of take the lead as far as being the centers of Jewish life. Now, when that started to happen, there developed a need to develop centers of learning in these new Jewish communities. So, for example, for a couple centuries, if you lived in France and you had a community in France, you were fine with the rabbi in France. It didn't need to be a big yeshiva there or a big center of learning there, because any question that was necessary, he would ask the Rav. If he knew the answer, good. If not, he would send a letter to Bavel, to Iraq, and he would get the response, in a week, whatever the case was in those days. It wasn't, you can't text it, it took time, but at the end of the day, you would send a question to Bavel and you would get a response. But when Bavel began to deteriorate, when Jews started to move away from Bavel and the yeshivas in Bavel began to fall apart, so now there was this huge vacuum that was there, and it was necessary. There was no place, for example, for that Jew in France or that rabbi in France to send his shiloh. So what was necessary to develop was for that in these countries that Jewish people were living already, there had to develop yeshiva systems. There had to develop schools to sort of create within themselves rabbis that would be able to answer any question they needed. So there's a fascinating thing how Hashgacha Pratis worked it out. It's a relatively famous story, so I'm not going to get into the details of it, but it's the story of the four captives. There's a rule that Hashem runs the world always. He brings the cure before the sickness, right? Refuah kod mumaka. So as the world of Bavel, the yeshiva system of Bavel, was beginning to decline, it was still there, it was still strong, but as it was beginning to decline, the following episode took place. What would take place very often was, in those days, is even to this day, there would be shluchim. There would be messengers sent out from Bavel throughout all of Europe to collect money for the yeshiva. That's what would be done, and they would make their rounds. They would go to Europe and different places, in Africa and the Far East and so on, in order to collect money for their yeshiva. So the story goes that there was who they would send to collect money were considered big Rosh Hashivas. They wouldn't send the Gabbaim. They would send very respected rabbis of the Jewish community in Bavel to collect money for the yeshivas. So the story goes that there was 4 of these Rosh Hashivas on one boat together, and the boat was heading out again from Bavel, from Iraq to Europe, and this boat was hijacked by pirates. And these pirates realized that they had 4 Jews on the boat, and they didn't know exactly who these Jews were and how important they were, and it's good that they didn't, but they knew that Jews pay a lot of money to ransom each other, so they offered different communities within the Jewish world the ability to ransom these different rabbis. And different communities in Europe and different communities in North Africa and in Spain and so on, each city, each country ransomed a specific rabbi. And what's amazing is when these rabbis were ransomed by these communities, right away, what they started to do, they set up shop in those countries. They brought their families with them, and what they did is they started to create yeshivas. And this is taking place as the country of Bavel was on decline. These four rabbis from Bavel in these different countries throughout Europe started to develop yeshiva systems within Europe. And this was the heal. This was the cure before the sickness, because now, let's say a little bit of time later, when the country of Bavel really collapsed and the Jewish community over there fell apart and the yeshivas stopped over there, now you already had for a good 50 years yeshivas that were set up in Europe and in Morocco and in these countries and in North Africa that had at least the strength to now develop rabbis that were able to answer questions amongst themselves. So this was really the beginning of a time period of Rishonim, where no longer was the central place of learning and the central answer to every question Bavel. Now the questions would be answered, organically from amongst these countries themselves. So this is where where big disagreements really started to develop amongst the Jewish people, because if everyone is centered in one place and everyone's learning under the same rabbi, so like I said before, the differences that will take place, that will come up amongst the students, will be subtle. Because at the end of the day, they're both learning from the same yeshiva and the same rabbi, so there'll be subtle differences, but nothing really major. But now, where we have this new development, where each country is really isolated, because in those days there wasn't a lot of travel between countries. Each country is isolated and developing their own style of learning and their own system of learning and their own way to tackle questions. So now the differences and the variations that you'll find between one rabbi in France and another rabbi in Spain dealing with the same question, the differences will be vast of how they come to answer such a question, because they're not coming from the same system, they're not coming from the same way of learning, and because again, each country developed its own style, and people are different, and societies are different, cultures are different, and the way people think are different. This is where we really started to see historically the development of very different ways of learning and very, very different ways of practical halacha that comes from that learning. And this is where you had, what's truly amazing about this is really fascinating, is where it's amazing to see how all these different countries and all these different rabbis in their own systems, in their own specific systems in all these different countries, it's fascinating that they're all dealing with the same question. For example, you have, you can have Wtntu in France, that was the yeshiva system in France that organically produced Wtntu, who was one of the leading Tosos in Europe. And you have on the other side of the world, you have, let's say, the Rajba in Spain, who again organically developed in Spain in that school of thought. And it's amazing how such different people from such different backgrounds and such different schools of thought are both dealing with the same exact questions in the Gemara. They're both learning, Bab Metzia, and they're both dealing with the same exact question. And the difference only is how they deal to answer that question. Wtntu, in his style, in his yeshiva system, they developed a way of answering the question in one way. And in the Rajba, in the style in Spain, they developed to answer the question in a different way. And the way they answer the question, that split up how they deal, what the practical result of that Gemara is. That's the way how learning was done during this time period. Again, we're talking about, from let's say, 900 till about 1400. This is the way it was. Throughout the entire period of time, you have these different countries throughout Europe and so on developing their own system and their own style. And again, it's fascinating to see every single one of them, for the vast majority of cases, they're dealing with the same question. It's the same contradiction in the Gemara between one place and another. It's the same question in logic that they're not understanding a certain logic that the Gemara offered. And it's the same questions. It's a question of how to answer it. Now, a little bit of just to give a little bit perspective, throughout this time period, which again we're talking about, let's say from 900 to about 1400, there were basically, let's say basically 5 different countries and 5 different centers of learning that developed their own individual style. As I said, they all were dealing with the same issues, but they developed a distinct style of their own to answer them. The different places were as follows. In France, northern France and Germany, that was one school. That was that school that developed Rashi, and it developed Tosfos, and it developed the Rosh. all when we say Ashkenazi Rishonim, that was really the school of Germany and northern France, which in those days was one country. So it was Germany and northern France, that's one school. You had the school of Egypt. Egypt had its own style, its own distinct style that developed and created the system of the Rambam, which is also very, very unique and different, and a very stark contrast between him and the world of the Ashkenazi Jews of Rashi and Tosfos and Rosh in Germany and northern France. Then you had another school of Spain, which developed the Ramban, Nachmanides, and the Rajba, and the Ritva, and so on, which again had its own distinct style. Another major school was the school in Italy, which, it's a fascinating school by themselves, that also they developed, that's where the Aruch lived. That's where Tosfos Rid and Tosfos Riaz and so on, other people that developed in that school. Now, there was one specific place that was sort of a melting pot of many different countries and many different cultures in the secular world, in the secular aspect, and also in the Torah world as well, which was southern France. Politically speaking, again, we don't have time to go into this at great length, but politically speaking, the country of southern France at those days was called Provence. That country, the government that was running that country was very much, was more of a liberal country. Most of these places were run by governments that were exceedingly, religious and very zealous about their religion, and therefore there wasn't a lot of communication and open lines of traveling between one country and the other. So, for example, the rulers of Germany who were starch, who were very, very strong Catholics, they're not going to have much dialogue with Egypt, and Spain, which was basically primarily Islamic. The one country that was more liberal about this was southern France. And it's fascinating because of that liberalism that took place, that was existing in southern France. So there was a lot of trade that took place there. There was a lot of communication that took place there. And in learning as well, many Sephardim and many Egyptian Jews and many North African Jews and many Ashkenazi Jews all lived in that country, southern France. So it was really in southern France where a different style developed, which was a little bit of a cohesiveness and a melting pot of all these different styles. And by the way, it's just a fascinating thing. A lot of times we read in Jewish history about certain controversies that took place. Like, for example, when the Rambam wrote his book, The Guide to the Perplexed, which in his country of Egypt and that part of the world where he developed his school, that was accepted with open arms. That was part of their culture, part of their society. When that book made its way to Europe, it was completely foreign to them, because again, that was a school, that was a sefer that developed organically from that world in Egypt that was completely unknown to the world of Europe. The one country that this book was a major hot topic in was southern France, because see, in Germany and northern France, it was completely looked at as completely foreign. It wasn't, controversy only starts when you have some people that like it and some people that don't. When everyone is in agreement that they don't like it, there's not much controversy with that. So, in Ashkenaz itself, in Germany and northern France, it wasn't controversial. It just wasn't accepted. It was in Egypt where the Rambam lived. It wasn't controversial. Everyone loved it. It was in southern France where you had such a melting pot of different cultures and different types of Jews. That's when it was, a firestorm of controversy. Do we like it? Is it right? Is it not right? This type of learning, all that stuff. It was all in southern France. So those are basically the schools that developed, and each one, again, had its own style and its own way of thinking. This was going on till about the 1400s. And like I said, each school developed its own way of thinking. Maybe, I guess we'll stop with this, and the next time that we get together, we'll go on to the next stage, which was what happened after this. Where did the Shulchan Aruch come? Where did Rabbi Yosef Karo come in to sort of bring these worlds together to give a cohesiveness to the Jewish people? And as we'll see, but as of right now, this time period, again, we're talking about post-Bavel, post-Iraq, which is about 900 to about 1400. You had each culture in each different country developing its own systems, and to each his own. Each one followed its thing, and Shalom Yisrael, everyone got along because there wasn't much communication between the two. And in that, like I said, in that one country that there was a lot of communication, there was a lot of politics and difficulty that was going on there. But that's as far as this time period. This is the time period that we call the time period of the Rishonim, which is, again, where each country organically had its system, its way of learning, its style, and the citizens of those countries followed their rabbis. And that was it. And there was no Sfardim and Ashkenazim within a country. Everyone did its thing. Okay, so we'll stop with this. So again, if there's any questions, then please feel free. If not, we'll just continue next time.
Okay, I'm just unmuting everybody in case anybody has a question. Go ahead. Okay.
Okay, very good.
Okay, thanks.
Let's go. See everyone later.